So let me give you a historical example of exactly what I'm talking about. And in this, I'm going to give an example of precedent and what it means to locate precedent, and also an example of the doctrine of stare decisis. So back in 1895 was a very famous case. For those of you who have taken American history, you probably remember this. It was a case called Plessy versus Ferguson. And once again, I'm not going to go into the details of the case because they're not relevant to what we're talking about. But if you click on the link, you can read about Plessy versus Ferguson. In this case, it was essentially about segregating transportation facilities. What I mean by that is that by law, blacks and whites were in separate places in public facilities. We call that segregation. The races were segregated, kept apart. And there was a black person, or technically a black person, who refused to go sit in the white section. Or if he refused to sit in the black section, I apologize. And so this person was arrested. And the person argued that the law that required a segregation of the two races was a violation of the 14th Amendment. The 14th Amendment was one of the amendments that was passed before the Civil War, after the Civil War. And it required due process of law for everybody. So this person basically said, it also said that everybody got equal protection under the law. So whether you're black or whether you're white, based on the 14th Amendment, everybody was due equal protection under the law. And so the person, Mr. Ferguson, argued that the law that required segregation was a violation of his 14th Amendment rights. Excuse me. In that case, somewhat infamous and disgusting case, the Supreme Court came up with this doctrine of separate but equal, that you could have separate facilities for blacks and whites, and that did not violate the 14th Amendment. Now, just to be historically accurate, the facilities, when blacks and whites were in segregated facilities in the past, and this is true in the present, by the way, but we'll talk about that when we talk about civil rights. But when blacks and whites were segregated in different facilities, they were not equal. Black and white schools were not equal. Black and white hospitals were not equal. Black and white transportation facilities were not equal. But the courts basically, in this ruling in Plessy versus Ferguson, came up with this idea of separate but equal, and essentially said it's constitutional to do this. Now, leaving aside the fact that the decision is repugnant, especially now when we think about this, remember that what I'm talking about here is the concept of precedent and stare decisis. Well, after the ruling in Plessy versus Ferguson, that meant that the Plessy decision became a precedent. It became a case that if a judge past that point, after Plessy, if they were faced with a case that had to do with the segregation of races, when they looked back to previous cases to figure out how they should rule, Plessy versus Ferguson would be this important precedent that the Supreme Court set, right, that came up with this separate but doctrine idea. So the Plessy decision now became a precedent, something that a judge would look for if they were faced with a similar case. And after the Plessy versus Ferguson decisions, then, because of the doctrine of stare decisis, judges would follow the reasoning in cases after Plessy. So they would use the same reasoning the morally repugnant reasoning that the courts used in Plessy versus Ferguson to decide their cases. So in theory, even if they thought segregation was terrible, in theory, they would go ahead and they would say, well, this isn't about just my personal decision. The doctrine of stare decisis is very important. It's what provides stability. And especially soon after Plessy, they would uphold any laws that permitted segregation based on the decision in Plessy versus Ferguson. So Plessy versus Ferguson, once it's decided, becomes an example of a precedent, and deciding to uphold the reasoning in Plessy versus Ferguson is an example of stare decisis. Now, come 1954, we have the very famous case of Brown versus the Board of Education. Those of you who grew up in the United States have probably heard about this case before. For those who didn't, probably worth clicking on it and taking a look at it so you have an idea of what it's about. But generally, it was about the idea that schools were segregated in Kansas. Topeka is in Kansas. Schools were segregated in Kansas. And in this particular case, the court somebody challenged the law that segregated schools. And again, the court was forced to sort of look at past cases that dealt with segregation. Now, before I continue, you see a little asterisk next to 1954. What that asterisk denotes is that there were actually cases prior to Brown versus the Board of Education where the Supreme Court was slowly chipping away at the ruling in Plessy versus Ferguson. So in the 10 years prior to Plessy versus Ferguson, the Supreme Court got a number of different cases that had to do with segregation. And while they didn't throw out Plessy versus Ferguson completely, they sort of chipped away at the reasoning behind it. Well, in 1954, after Plessy versus Ferguson had sort of been chipped away, in 1954, in Brown versus Board of Education, the court completely reverses the ruling in Plessy versus Ferguson. They said, you know what? They got it wrong. They got it wrong. And they say that ruling before of separate but equal is flawed. If you have separate institutions, those separate institutions are inherently unequal. And what I mean by that is if they're separate, there's no possible way they can be equal. Now, they weren't equal just on the face of things. I mean, again, the schools, the hospitals, the public facilities, they weren't equal where the facilities for blacks and whites were not equal. But what the court said is they couldn't possibly be equal, because as soon as you separate the races by law, this becomes problematic. And so they came up with the new rule: separate, therefore inherently unequal. Well, what happens then? Remember, we're talking about examples of precedent and stare decisis. Well, after that ruling was made, now Brown versus the Board of Education becomes the new precedent. You know, if somebody's making a judge past that point is asked to make a decision on segregated facilities, right? They're going to look at the past rulings, but one of the things they're going to look at is the last big ruling. And they're going to look at all the cases that preceded Brown versus Board of Education, the 10 years in which the courts were chipping away at the reasoning behind in the Plessy versus Ferguson case. And then they're going to look at Brown versus Board of Education, and they're going to look at all the rulings prior. But Brown versus Board of Education is going to become a new precedent. It's one of the cases that they're going to look at when they are faced with a case having to do with the segregation of the races. And So that's the example of precedent, another example of precedent. And past 1954, judges followed the reasoning in Brown in all the cases after 1954. And that's an example of stare decisis, where the courts are not just making their own decisions based on their own personal feelings. They're looking at past cases, and then they're looking at the most recent precedents in this case and the reasoning in the most recent cases, and they're applying that to their own case that they're dealing with. So even if they think that a state might, perhaps they believe a state should be able to legally segregate schools or segregate hospitals, that's not the way it's supposed to work in our legal system. Judges don't make decisions just based on their own personal views. In that case, based on the doctrine of stare decisis, they should uphold the previous decisions. And that's basically what happened. And little by little, all forms of legal, well, not all forms, we'll talk about this in civil rights, but many of the forms of legal segregation were ruled unconstitutional after Brown versus Board of Education. That's an example of stare decisis. Okay, I know that the language is kind of complicated here, so you may need to watch it one more time. But precedent are the previous rulings that judges look to when they're deciding a case. And stare decisis is this general principle that judges are supposed to follow to let the decision stand. That if you see a consistent pattern of decisions in previous cases, let that previous reasoning guide your decision making. If you have any questions about that, post that on the discussion board, because I realize this stuff is really complicated.